Hi there everyone, and welcome to this Nordic Model Now webinar today. Thank you all so much for attending. First, just a few housekeeping things to get out of the way. As a participant and attendee, you can type questions into the Q&A box at any time. Please understand though, with the best will in the world, we probably won't have time to answer them all, although we are looking forward to seeing them. Any that aren't answered, we'll use to inform our future events. The hashtag for this event is NMNTalk. So if you're going to be tweeting about the event while this webinar is going on, please use this hashtag NMNTalk. Before I introduce our speakers, I'm going to quickly explain what the Nordic model is so that anyone who isn't sure or has more questions can understand where we are coming from as an organisation. The Nordic model has three key elements. So firstly, it decriminalises those who are prostituted. It provides services for those involved in prostitution to give support and help to leave the industry and rebuild a life outside. And under the Nordic model, prostitution buying becomes a criminal offence. So that's with the key aim of changing men's buyers' behaviour. Along with all this, there needs to be in place strong laws against pimping and human trafficking, a public information campaign, education in schools and colleges, training for the police and judiciary and other frontline staff, investment in real and viable alternatives for women, and measures to address the poverty and inequality that often brings so many women in particular into the sex industry. For those that don't know, the Nordic model was first introduced in Sweden in 1999. This was after feminists had conducted large-scale research on prostitution. They talked extensively to people who both bought sex and sold sex. The women who sold sex told of their paths into prostitution, about the men who bought them, about the relationships with pimps and drugs, about how prostitution affected them and the violence and shame that they had experienced, and about their survival strategies to cope. What the researchers found is that prostitution is it's an extreme and concentrated version of the general relationship between the sexes. Therefore, from our point of view, from the Nordic model's point of view, it makes no sense to punish the women involved. They are the ones whose choices are limited, and getting out of prostitution once embedded in it is very, very difficult and sometimes feels impossible. It became clear to the researchers in Sweden that prostitution exists because men buy sex. So if they were to reduce prostitution and the trafficking associated with it, they had realised what they had to do that was the most effective way to deal with it was challenge the men to change their belief that they have the right to buy sex from another human being. And that's the whole point of the law. Just as the law against smoking in pubs in the UK is not about demonising or criminalising smokers, it's primarily about changing attitudes and behaviours. The Nordic model, again, just so we're clear, we talk about women consistently because women are generally the group, the sex most affected. It applies to everyone, regardless of sex or gender, on both sides. In Sweden, there was much resistance at first from the police and those in authority, but this has improved after training was introduced that is really key alongside it. What's really interesting, I always find, is more than 2 decades later, the law has widespread public support in Sweden, particularly among the police, particularly among women, and also among young people of both sexes. It's one of the few places in Europe where prostitution and inward trafficking have not actually expanded much during that time frame. Quite a few other countries have followed Sweden in implementing the Nordic model with varying degrees of success and commitment, and with some slight differences. Those countries include, some of you will be aware or know of these examples in particular, of Norway, Iceland, Israel, France, and the Republic of Ireland. So after all that information there, and again, all questions welcome as we go through this webinar and afterwards on anything that we've said so far. This is what the Nordic model now is campaigning for. It's a human rights-based approach to prostitution legislation and policy. And just to make it clear with that, we do not believe that male violence is either biological or inevitable. It's socially constructed, and therefore it can be changed. What we're essentially talking about today is a message of hope, the feminist message that male violence isn't inevitable and that a different kind of world is possible. That doesn't mean, of course, that bringing about social change is easy. It never is. The attitudes underpinning prostitution are ingrained in all of us, and the social norms of it are deeply rooted, which we will go into a bit more detail today as well. What's more, that we're in an increasingly divided society. I'm sure nobody here needs me to tell you that. And what that does is it's predicated on us being divided so that we don't stand together in resistance, so that we don't realise what we have in common and fight for common causes. But even with that, change is possible. It just needs to be fought for. We must stand together as women and men against the inhumane prostitution system. And we hope this webinar you'll take away from that message of courage and determination and hope. And that is absolutely enough of me from now. You'll hear enough from me throughout this webinar. Who I'd really love for you to hear from now and find out a bit more about are our speakers today. We're going to have 3 short talks, and then we'll follow that up with the discussion of the 3 attendees we have today. Some of it for our first speaker. Some of you might have seen that a group called Decrim Now have recently published an open letter to MPs. This open letter was calling on MPs to vote against any attempts to introduce the Nordic model in Britain. Instead, they're calling for full decriminalisation of the entire sex trade. That does include pimps and brothel keepers. That they would be counted in that. Our next speaker, who can't be here in person but has sent us a video message, he is going to tell us why he thinks that's a mistake. His name is Bryn Freyr Smith. Bryn is an ex-UK police officer and human rights investigator. In 2018, he founded the Blue Bear Coffee Company. It's a social enterprise that raises money and awareness for organisations fighting human trafficking and cares for survivors of those abuses. He's also the host of the Justice and Coffee podcast and an active anti-trafficking campaigner. Just so you know, before we go on to Bryn's talk, and I will say this again, all of our social media and the social media and work of all of our speakers will be available at the end of this webinar and in the chat as well. As I said, Bryn can't be with us today in person, but he has sent us a recording, which we're now going to play.
Hello, my name is Bryn Freyr Smith. I run a social enterprise called Blue Bear Coffee Company, and we raise money for organisations fighting human trafficking and caring for survivors by selling ethically sourced coffee. We also have a podcast called the Justice and Coffee podcast, and I get to sit down with a special guest and talk justice or injustice and hear their stories of engaging with that topic over coffee. I recently encountered this movement, the decriminalisation of sex work. It sort of caught me by surprise, and I felt a little bit naive to the movement, so I wanted to research it, to understand it better and compare it with other models such as the Nordic model. And that's how I got to know Anna. We connected and she very kindly invited me to speak today. Excuse me. Now, unfortunately, when this is going out, I'm going to be at work and I can't be a part of the live event, but I wanted to contribute. And I have written a blog on some of my experiences with this subject, and it contains my opinion on it. And I'm going to read that today as my contribution. I would love to be there for the dialogue and the discourse, and I think the subject is a really valid one to discuss and bring into the public. So hopefully there'll be an opportunity on another occasion to be there to answer questions and to dialogue with the panelists. But for now, I'm just going to read my blog. So I'm going to try and do it without my glasses, so forgive me if I stumble over some of my words. Sonia was 23 when I met her. She graduated university the previous year with a degree in industrial engineering, but after 18 months of unanswered job applications, she'd become desperate. She'd been waiting tables in a restaurant, but the manager had to let her go in order to give her position to one of his children. Her studies had left her in debt, and she was acutely aware of the pressure she was now putting on her parents, who were already struggling financially. She hated being a burden, which was why she had decided to make a 3-hour bus trip to Boca Chica, a beach resort in the Dominican Republic, far enough away from home that she was unlikely to bump into anyone she knew. A friend had introduced her to a bar owner who let her try out that Friday night amongst the group of regular sex workers available for customers to choose from. Men would visit the bar, buy a drink, and be introduced to the women on offer that night. They would often then be expected to pick their favourite, buy her a drink, and make arrangements with the boss or madame. There was a bar fine to take the woman off site, somewhere between $10 and $20, and a further cost for whatever service they wished to procure. Sometimes you had to pay the bar owner, sometimes you'd pay the woman directly. More often than not, there was a small, dank, sweaty room available on site with a couple of thin towels, cheap condoms, and a well-worn mattress if the trip to a nearby hotel was too much of an ask. The prices usually range from between $20 to $40 for full sex, less if you were paying a street worker. Not a lot of money, you might think, but with an average starting salary in the Dominican Republic ranging from $80 to $140 a month, it is perhaps clearer why the country has one of the highest prostitution rates in the world. I met Sonia while working as part of an investigation team for a human rights NGO, looking into the sex trafficking of children in the DR. Now that night it appeared that all of the sex workers in the bar were adult. They had access to mobile phones and seemed to come and go with relative agency. But Sonia somehow looked out of place. The bar was small, the music loud, and the neon-shaded air was thick with sweat and the hormones of randy, white middle-aged men looking for a good time. It was clear to me, by the way she held her body, her choice of clothing, and her general demeanour, that Sonia was uncomfortable in this environment. This was a tricky one. I knew she wasn't a minor, and thus didn't fall into the focus of our investigation, but I wanted to know more. In broken Spanish, I asked if we could go outside to talk, somewhere where we could hear each other better. I offered to buy her a drink. She asked for a Coke. We sat on two red plastic chairs 10 feet from the front door. One of my colleagues stood by the road smoking a cigarette, watching my back, as I tried to establish the circumstances that had led Sonia to this place. She was sweating profusely and apologised each time she wiped her brow with a tissue. She answered my questions like she was at a job interview. There was nothing flirtatious or sexually provocative about her, and after she explained her situation and the fact that this happened to be her first night, I could see why. She looked terrified. Economic circumstances beyond her control had led her to making a hard choice from a list of poor options. She told me that she didn't want to be there, but she felt she had to do something to help out at home. After about 15 minutes, I made my excuses and left, frustrated by my inability to affect this situation and saddened by the idea that, to Sonia, I was a potential customer who'd just rejected her. The thought of Sonia returning inside the bar made me nauseous. I swallowed hard, hoping to suppress the experience as just another sad story, one of many that I would encounter that year. I recently attended an online panel discussion on sex trafficking. I was surprised when 3 of the 5 guest speakers seemed to use this platform to promote the international decriminalisation of sex work. I have to confess to being somewhat ignorant to the decrim movement. I had heard of the Nordic model, first trialled by Sweden and more recently in Northern Ireland, where the buyer is criminalised as opposed to the sex worker, who's offered a number of supporting measures to help them leave the industry. I was also aware of the disastrously ineffective legalisation approach evident in Holland and parts of Germany, where the state is given the role of brothel keeper, protecting its sex workers through regulation and licensing. As an ex-UK police officer, I'm very familiar with the Part D crim model we have here, where it's legal for a sex worker to operate alone from a private residence, but the management of brothels and street solicitation remains a criminal act. The decriminalisation movement, now supported by Amnesty International and the UN, however, had somehow passed me by. I was initially dubious. Surely this would lead to greater levels of sex trafficking, wouldn't it? But with the growing tide of support coming from NGOs and human rights organisations, I chose to resist the temptation of confirmation bias and instead lean into what I could learn from websites, podcasts and TED Talks given by proponents of the decrim movement to better inform my opinion. I believe that there is a great deal of validity in much of what this movement has to say. I agree that the criminalisation of sex workers does nothing other than to perpetuate a cycle of vulnerability and abuse. I know that traffickers exploit the illegal nature of sex work to deter their victims from looking for help. Survivors in the UK have told me how they were fearful of being arrested and deported, or worse, not believed, should they reach out to the authorities. I remember my time in the Metropolitan Police Service, trudging into East London brothels with a cadre of 6-foot-plus knuckle-dragging police officers in body armour and wondering why the women wouldn't engage with us. The status quo is most certainly in need of reform. But it's the philosophy of the decrim movement I can't find peace with. A philosophy that says sex work is work, as if the selling of someone's body can be compared to and thus should be treated like any other job. The movement also seems to give the impression that all of those entering the sex industry do so with agency and would rather not be labelled a victim or disempowered by the sympathetic head tilt of well-intended do-gooders. This point I can sympathise with. But what about the girls and young women who enter the sex industry with little or no choice of their own, whether they are the victims of human trafficking or of child abuse, domestic violence or economic hardship? Would they proudly choose to identify as a sex worker? One study conducted by the European Parliament estimates that the average age of a sex worker to be somewhere between 13 and 25 years old. The UK charity Streetlight reports that 9 out of 10 of the sex workers they have engaged with would choose not to be working in prostitution. So I have to question this movement, whether this movement is accurately representing the sex industry as a whole, or rather a reflection of those who are capable of freely articulating their position. As I understand, the decriminalisation model is distinct from the legalisation model in the fact that it doesn't want state interference at all. Rather, it requests to be left alone, to organise and self-regulate, that sex workers don't, in fact, want any help leaving the industry. But I would want us to remember that there's estimated to be over 100,000 people living in slavery in the UK today, many of whom are trafficked into massage parlours and pop-up brothels up and down the country, forced against their will to service 5, 10, 20 men a day. Should they be left alone too? A fact I know to be true is that law enforcement is inextricably political. Policing budgets are spent keeping communities happy as well as safe. That's why reducing antisocial behaviour often receives a higher level of investment than targeting organised crime. As soon as something is labelled legal, you can bet your last Rolo it will no longer be considered a policing priority. And the finite resources afforded to proactive investigations will be directed elsewhere. the searchlights will move on, much to the delight of the criminal fraternity who profit from the trafficking and exploitation of girls and women throughout this country. Are these groups expected to disappear when sex work is decriminalised? When the brothels and pimps are legitimised and the police stop passing attention, who will be responsible for rooting out the organised criminals? The Department of Working Pensions? The issue of human trafficking seems to me to be somewhat sidelined by this movement, as if it's an inconvenient fact. The principal references to it express the frustration that sex trafficking is wrongfully conflated with sex work. That the sex work is work movement is premised on the belief that what sex workers want most in the world is to have the legal right and protection to sell their bodies, not to live in a world where they don't have to sell their bodies to pay the bills and survive. There was a study conducted in 2013 by students from the London School of Economics who found that the rate of trafficking victims increases in countries where sex work is legal. New Zealand's decriminalisation of sex work is often heralded as evidence of this model working, as the data suggests that since prostitution was decriminalised, the trafficking rate has remained the same. A fact that I find surprising, as I would have expected if the authorities are no longer monitoring the sex industry as they were before. Should we not expect a dramatic reduction in identified victims of trafficking? But in this case, we haven't. So is it then appropriate to hold up this country as an example of the decrim model working? For me, the accent is in the wrong place. The focus is on the decriminalisation of the sex industry, rather than the aspiration of equal access to safe employment and state support, rather than challenging gender inequality by educating girls and protecting them from forced marriage, rather than improving the police response to rape allegations, child abuse and domestic violence with the expansion of specially trained officers and victim-friendly courts, rather than targeting the gross inequality that exists in this world between those with and those without. Perhaps I'm being wistfully hopeful to imagine a world where the $186 billion spent each year in the global sex industry went towards closing the divide between the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-nots. It's possible that I'm behind the times on this, and I hope I hold my views lightly enough to change them if evidence causes me to do so. But today, I am concerned that the decriminalisation of sex work, proposed with the best of intentions, will in fact draw a veil over those women and girls who do not enter the industry with autonomy, but rather are being exploited by a third party, profiting from their vulnerability. After meeting Sonia, I persuaded the team to go back with me the next night. Perhaps it wasn't too late for her. Perhaps we could take her to dinner, give her the night off at least, encourage her to go home and explore other options. It was a dangerous move to make. Boca Chica was a small beach town and there was every chance we would need to return to this bar again. Burning ourselves would not help future investigations, but I felt it was worth a shot. It was Saturday night and I knew my colleagues would far prefer to be at home with their families than out with me in the red light district. I alighted from our jeep and strolled confidently towards the security guard, lifting my arms out to the side and bringing him in for a bro hug. Hola hermano, ¿qué tal? My casual and buoyant facade hiding the true purpose of my visit. I scanned the women perched on plastic chairs outside the front door, but she wasn't there. I went inside. It was still early and the bar was quiet. There was one overweight American man in sandals and a cowboy hat sat at the bar pouring cheap champagne for a woman half his age in the honest held belief that his presence there was actually doing her a massive favour. Sonia wasn't there. I wondered if, after our short conversation, she'd taken a bus home. She'd realised it wasn't for her and she'd returned to Mum and Dad with a different plan. The weight that had sat on my shoulders for the past 24 hours began to lift when the barman asked me who I was looking for. Se llama Sonia. I was speaking to her last night. The barman shook his head. Sorry, bro. A customer picked her up about 30 minutes ago. He's got her for the weekend.
I'll just say thanks to Bryn, even though he's not here. It's really interesting to hear his feedback on when he talked about the example of Sonia, the link between prostitution and poverty and economic factors and lack of opportunities for women in particular. It's interesting to hear someone who's worked in both policing and in directly caring for survivors, and the very nuanced thoughts he's had on that from his experience. That's how a lot of us come to advocating for the Nordic model, is considering everything, everything that's out there, everything that you can read, everything you find online, including Nordic Models Now's own website, and coming to that conclusion of why to support the Nordic model. So thank you again, Bryn. Our next speaker is Gemma HSM, who I'm really excited to hear from today. Gemma is a working class radical feminist. She runs Yes Matters UK. It's an organisation to support the rehabilitation of children who've suffered sexual abuse. Her work includes challenging the lack of access to justice for women and girls, compulsory sex education, and presenting to the European Parliament research on the dangers of gender stereotypes, in particular around the objectification of women and girls. Gemma would like us all to know she is the sister of a murdered girl, a survivor of child sexual abuse, rape and domestic abuse, and she doesn't care that it's not all men. Gemma, I'm really excited to hear from you today, so I'll hand the floor over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I hope you're all well. So the first thing that I want to address is sexual objectification. And the reason that I think that's really important is because it is part of pornography. It is part of prostitution and the sex industry. And it is the root cause and has a direct link with violence against women and girls. This is not my opinion. This is an informed view. Thousands, if not millions, of reports in every field you can imagine. The sexual objectification of women and girls has a direct link to violence against women and girls, and it cannot be separated. And I have had the argument that sexual objectification is in fact empowering, and I just wanted to go into that a little bit. So sexual objectification, you think of an object. An object is there to serve the needs of the subject. When you think of women, we see this in childcare, we see it in pornography, we see it in prostitution, we see it in unpaid labour. The object is there to the product specification of the subject. We see this in the beauty industry, the diet industry, the fashion industry, and again in pornography. The object is acted upon by the subject. There is no such thing as an empowered object. An object doesn't have desires to act upon the subject. That's not how it works. It's the other way around. So no matter how good an object you are never going to be empowered. The other thing about the object is that they are replaceable and they are disposable. And we see that when we see that we have a domestic homicide historical high at the same time as we have a historical low in rape convictions. And the fact that as long as I've been alive, a few women a week being murdered by their partners has been the acceptable status quo. There's been no public panic about it. There's been no change in dealing with it. There's been no public or government reports about how we're going to address that pandemic. It's just been acceptable. Because we're women, we are acceptable collateral damage because we are objects. And so the dehumanisation of groups happened before violence of groups. In fact, there's a very famous police quote where it states that objectification is the first step in any violence because it's the first step in justification of that violence. We've seen this throughout history. We've seen it in racism and the slave trade. We've seen it towards Jewish people. We've seen it throughout the world and throughout history, the othering, the dehumanisation of the group before acting upon the group, because the object acts. The object is acted upon by the subject, however it wants. So this we see in particular in pornography, which is what I wanted to talk to you about today. Some people argue that pornography is filmed prostitution. Pornography is a huge issue for me, a huge issue. With the work that I have with young people, sex education and pornography are one and the same thing. And essentially, pornography has become more and more violent to keep up with popularity. We also see in pornography the gender stereotypes of the dominant male and the submissive female, the subject acting upon the object over and over again. And people say to me, oh, well, it's harmless fantasy. And I argue, if it's harmless fantasy and it's, you know, it's healthy, it can't both be healthy and also the defence for murder for 68 men in 2020 as to reasons why they murdered women, because they used the rough sex defence. It cannot both be a good defence for murder and healthy and natural. Pornography is essentially the abuse of women and girls put into entertainment categories and labelled as free speech. That is what pornography is. And it is also a groomer of children. Because if you put yourself in the position of a teenage boy just coming to terms with his sexuality and going on to porn for the first time, the average age of exposure to pornography in the UK is 11 years old. He is told by Pornhub and other places that this is what you should find sexy, and this is how sex is supposed to be, increasingly violent. These days, pornography, mainstream pornography includes strangulation, or as they call it, breath play. It includes verbal assault and physical assault, being urinated on, being spat on, hair being pulled. In the mainstream. And what more positive reinforcement could you have for behaviour than an orgasm? This teaches boys and girls alike that this is what is expected in sex and this is healthy. It's grooming children into essentially accepting abuse in relationships. And when we identify what the most popular or highest consumed categories, they are teen and barely legal, they are revenge porn, and they are incest. So essentially, the most popular pornography is the one without consent. It isn't just two people that really like each other that happen to be having sex on film. This is not what this is. That is not what pornography is. And when we think about pornography and its influence and how it has more consumers or more viewers than Sky, Netflix, Apple TV, Prime, all combined, and yet without regulation, we also see implications in wider society and attitudes. We see it in our justice system. And so 30 years ago, where there would be a trial for rape, if the woman said that she was strangled and that she was beaten up and urinated on and her hair pulled and she was called a whore and a slag and that she deserved it, the jury would have been shocked and horrified. But now, given that it's, you know, it's part of mainstream pornography, the perpetrator can argue, well, I thought that's what sex was. And so the where consent is now, it's now shifted by the implications of pornography. The police officer's attitude when she tells the story will be different if he's consuming such material. The judge's attitude, the jury's attitude will also be different. In a rape trial, it has to be proved that she didn't consent and that he knew she didn't consent. And if that boy has grown up and been consuming pornography that has included abuse and violence, then he can say that he didn't know that she didn't consent to that. Pornography shouldn't have any place in our justice system. Pornography is inherently sexist, and it is, of course, racist. But of course, we other ourselves here in Britain from racism, as we've seen by recent reports, and we point over at countries and point over at the child brides and call them disgusting and disgraceful. And yet Britain is the third highest consumer of child abuse and child pornography in the world. Our hands are not clean. Pornography also reinforces the infantilization of women. We try and make them as thin and hairless as little girls. That also has implications. We sexualize the teens and the children to lower and lower ages, and that has implications. Essentially, pornography and sexual objectification of women and girls. It says that it's okay to treat women and girls as objects. And as our bodies are piling up throughout the years over and over again, and it's accepted as though we are objects, as though we are collateral damage because we are disposable and replaceable, we need to understand that it is not empowering, that it is grooming, and that until we address sexual objectification of women and girls, we will not be addressing violence against women and girls. And until we address it, we will not become people, we will not become human, and therefore we will not be respected and treated as a human being. And for me, boys and girls, men and women, we all deserve better than this. We deserve better than product and consumer. We deserve better than subject and object. And we deserve better than our abuse being called empowering. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gemma, for speaking to us today and for your contribution. I really look forward to hearing from you, as I'm sure everyone does later on. Just a couple of things that you touched on is that it's so significant that pornography tells boys a certain message that you should want this. And we talked earlier in the webinar about that as an organisation and as speakers here today, we don't believe that male violence is inherent or is inevitable. It's so troubling, like, to tell young boys that this type of violence, this type of coercion is what you do want, because inherently they don't. Most of us don't, and we understand that it's not okay when we see it. So that's a really great point. Thank you for that. And every time, I've heard you say it before, but the rough sex defence, as it was called, that's 68 women, and that's 68 women too many. So it always gives me a moment. So thank you so much again, Gemma. And we're now going to move to our next speaker for the day, our third speaker, who is Michael Conroy. Hello, Michael. Michael is the founder of Men at Work, and he's the creator of the Men at Work 10 Dialogues resources for working with boys and young men. Michael's worked in secondary education for 16 years. He trains educators and youth workers on how to run constructive dialogues with themes, varying from and touching on sexism, misogyny, objectification, risk-taking behaviours, peer pressure, and mental health. He's also a youth mental health instructor and is trained in suicide prevention. So hello, Michael, and welcome.
Hi, thank you very much for having me. I'm very grateful. Really important event with some, fantastic speakers already, and I know at least one more to come, and really looking forward to the Q&A later on. Just really echoing and amplifying everything that Gemma particularly has just said there. And I think the challenge that I'd like to speak about is how to get the truths that Gemma condensed so well in her slot there into the school context, into secondary certainly, and how to have those constructive conversations, because, you know, let's be frank, they don't happen. Not in a structured way, not in an organised way. The phenomena of prostitution and all that it entails is something that is really not discussed at all in state education, as far as I'm aware, probably not also in independent education. Between 11 and 18, it forms very small part of a discussion about trafficking, which may be in the curricula, but again, the way that PSHE, which is, you know, personal social health education, and RSE, relationship, sex ed, and citizenship, and the various ways that these things are framed and labelled in England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, it is attached briefly to a discussion on trafficking, which is, you know, perfectly valid, but that might amount to, in real terms, possibly 20 minutes in a young person's entire school career. And when we look at the complex harms and impacts of prostitution, the sex trade, in all its various shifting and kind of evolving forms, that isn't even, to say it's not good enough doesn't really even, is not good enough in itself. You know, 20 minutes for something that is so important and has such a cultural reach and cultural impact in terms of how it represents, you know, the power imbalance between men and women, between white people, white men particularly, and women of colour around the world, which is a huge part of porn. It's racial categorization. If you know, on things like Pornhub, people are basically segregated and separated and fetishized and exoticized in ways that would make a Victorian blush, and not in a prudish sexual Victorian blush, but in their wildest fantasies. If they were told 100 years ago that in 2020 men would be buying sexual access to women from around the world, women and girls and children, of course, based on really crude racial stereotyping, they would have considered their work done. So this is an enormous phenomena which reaches into lots of areas of people's lives, and really we need to develop the skills for teenagers, adolescents, to be able to have meaningful conversations about this. The context for that could be human rights. It could it's a blank canvas at the moment, because so little is done in schools in structural ways, that the question and the challenge is, how do we do it? You know, who do we need? What kind of grassroots campaign, networking, collaborations? No one organisation is capable, I don't think, in terms of scale. So we need to. When I say we need, I'm not waiting for somebody else to do it. You know, I think that you should always try to contribute to being the thing that you see is not there. I know I think it's Gandhi. I don't quote people very often, but I think it's a really simple thing: be the change you want to see. It's used, no doubt, in corny ways, lots of ways, but I think it has a very strong, simple truth about it, in a sense. Is if something isn't there, how do we make it there? How do we build it? How do we create it? And I think the work that I have moved into over the last 5-6 years has been about that. Is about trying to make sure there are dialogues, and there's a framework for dialogues which are collaborative and mutually respectful, non-accusatory, but that are not naive and are aware of the fact that, you know, young men, young boys are watching or being exposed to porn one way or another, whether it's voluntarily or being sent stuff by their mates, or even sadly by family members, including parents and carers. And we need to deal with that, because their sexual development is happening at the time when they're being bombarded with the propaganda of the porn industries, which are based on absolutely non-egalitarian foundations and bases. So we've got the makings of a terrible generational problem here. We're at a historical moment which has no precedent in terms of the access of anybody with smartphones or tablets, whatever it is. If you've got Wi-Fi, you've got porn. Basically, I think we need to cut to the chase and acknowledge that the filters don't work very well. A lot of parents are not very tech savvy, or don't care, or are actually think, oh well, he's got to learn somehow or other, and they'd rather let the porn industry, if we can call it that. It almost seems like we're doing it a favour by calling it an industry, but this kind of phenomena of film sexual abuse being deployed as a kind of a teacher in some way. And schools are hugely overworked. They are underfunded. I know that. I've worked in high schools every day for 16 years. All of my family are teachers or educators, and that's 10 adults with God knows how many decades of work between them, but that's head teachers, deputies, teachers of, classroom teachers. So it's not a case of saying, teachers, you need to do this, because that's just not fair, and who's going to resource it. But I would just sketch out a vision that I've got where school leaders, Department of Education, Department of Health, child development specialists, youth psychologists, educational psychologists, collaborate with a really urgent COVID-style national focus on preparing young people to be able to withstand the propaganda that pornography is. And that's propaganda that consolidates male supremacy over women, and that's men over women, males over females. Also, propaganda which is deeply racist, deeply class-based as well, because the poorer you are, the more likely you are to become, your chances are diminished, your options in life are diminished. As Bryn's talk, mentioned briefly over the Dominican Republic, but that's as true in Europe or in Britain as it is in the Dominican Republic and every other country. Your socioeconomic framework will have a huge relevance on whether you end up in what is euphemistically and completely erroneously described as sexual, commercialized access to women and girls' bodies, and some young men's as well. So I do ramble somewhat. I just thought I will try to focus on, I want to just play a part in a national conversation, a strategy of normalising really challenging and age-appropriate conversations for boys and young men, specifically, on understanding and resisting the phenomena of pornography and prostitution, because they are very much linked. And to understand what Gemma said beautifully, I thought about the difference between subject and object, and what does being a subject mean? Agency and decision-making capacity, and when things happen and when things don't happen, and what happens and what doesn't happen, and that comes right back down to how do we socialise boys and young men to understand what being a man is in our culture. And I think that conversation about power imbalance and about misogyny would feed into conversations, therefore, naturally, about prostitution and about porn and about street harassment and about harassment, sexual harassment at work and online, because the fundamentals are in that sense of entitlement and a different, a hierarchical value between men and women, sorry. To get to the fundamentals of that can be done with teenage boys. It is done. It's about respect. It's about autonomy. It's about understanding the difference between people and things, objects, and living sentient beings, you know, with complex personalities and needs and desires. And we need to get into that. And I know, because I work in schools in England, you know, I know less about Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, but I think there is some strong common ground. Those conversations don't really take place, and they have to start as soon as possible with as many people as possible in a really kind of far-reaching and optimistic and evidence-based network, coalition, alliance, whatever you want to call it. It's in everybody's interests to normalise a really deep critical conversation about the social construction of masculinity. Really, for me, it comes back to that all the time, of we are trained to see ourselves as having the upper hand, deserving the upper hand, being of a different kind of humanity, and that allows some of the worst crimes known in our society to be perpetrated by people drawing on that, by men drawing on that kind of cultural conditioning. And we need to challenge it in simple, clear, direct terms, collaborative, rational, evidence-based, with teenage boys specifically, but also clearly a lot of work needs to be done with teenage girls as well, because they are absorbing this same propaganda and being on the receiving end of it. Now, I fear I may have gone over time, but just to say, it's an open invitation. Let's work together. Whatever you do, social work, youth work, violence reduction, anti-bullying, whatever we do, you know, communally and collaboratively, if we focus on getting to the roots of a notion that men are entitled to women, then that is important work, and it's work that if we don't do it, then we're just going to be here in 30, 40 years having the same conversations, and that's something that we don't want to do. Is that all right, Siobhan, for time?
I think we're all right for time for now, but I'm sure I'll get poked if we're not. So, but no, thank you for that, Michael. And we'll have the opportunity in like the follow-up discussion between yourself and Gemma and Esther to kind of follow up on some of those points, which were again just so interesting. And I'm sure we could all be here all afternoon. You know, you were very consistent with Gemma, and that you know. She'd said about like telling that pornography gives that message to boys of what they should want, and what you're saying is like they don't think that's what they want. This is something they're being conditioned. This is something that they're being told to from a very early age when they're very young and vulnerable and susceptible. It was, you know, I really liked what you said, and I hope we can go into more about having those dialogues with boys and young men that in a way that is realistic, is not pushing it under the rug, is not kidding on it doesn't happen, but is non-accusatory, is age appropriate, and is ultimately optimistic. That's what I understand from your saying, and the adults need to be the guiding factor in that, in whatever role you play in that child's life, because unfortunately some of the porn consumption and the behaviours of some young boys and men, like there really is no other outcome if they're being given this material with no adult guidance and no one to turn to who they can trust, who can say, well, how do you feel about that? Let's talk about that. And it sounds like you and your organisation give boys and young men the space to do that. So it'll be really interesting to hear a bit more about that. So Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So now, everybody, you'll be glad to hear you're not going to hear too much more from me. We're going to move on to a discussion based on questions that have been sent in by audience members. Some of them are the ones you have sent in today. Please keep the questions coming, everybody. Thank you for engaging with us, and questions that have also been sent in previously. Bryn, as we said, isn't able to join us today, but along with Gemma and Michael, who've already spoken, we're delighted to have Esther with us. Esther has a long-standing interest and contribution on research on legal and public policy approaches to sexualised violence and domestic abuse. She uses her own experiences of being in porn and prostitution to reflect on these issues. So we'll take the questions as they are, even though some might contain language or suggestions that we don't necessarily agree with. That's what we're here for, us to have this open discussion and to hear all opinions. So Gemma, Michael and Esther, if you're ready, it would be great to hear from you. And I'll get a question up for you. So are we all okay for me to just start with the first question that we have that we've pulled in? Is that okay?
Yeah, it's fine.
Thanks, everybody. So we've had a question from a 21-year-old woman who said she remembers being in school in recent years with sex education focusing on the importance of consent. But now she's at university, she's told by many of her psychology lecturers that sex work should be legalised and is empowering. For her, this position of consent as a commodity that can be bought and sold is in stark contrast to the way she was taught in sex education. And she wants to know, do the panel think this undermines the importance of consent we try to convey it to young people?
It absolutely does. I did notice that someone else asked about making better sex education, and I did campaign for that and helped to write it, and the new consent-based sex education was supposed to be out in 2020, but obviously we had a little bit of a pandemic, so it didn't really get rolled out much. But yeah, there does seem to be different agendas, but you know, again, universities and university professors especially, I would suggest looking at the class imbalance there. I mean, there aren't going to be very many people directly affected by the sex industry who are advocating for that. There aren't very many, or when I went to university, there weren't very many County State girls going, and there certainly weren't any County State professors when I was there. So I would say that perhaps class has something to do with it. I'll let Michael chime in there.
Oh yeah, class is always, it's part of everything, obviously, like race. It does often get forgotten, I think, but we need to bring class back into a lot of conversations. I'd say, like in academia, well, first off, this young woman sounds like her gut feeling is that what the lecturers are saying is bullshit, and I agree with her. That sounds like a good thing. She knows. It sounds like she's, you know, switched on and is finding their commentary problematic and inconsistent because it is. I think the problem, really briefly, for so much of academia is completely kind of captured by the nonsense of queer theory, which basically says everything is subjective, everything is relative, nothing is concrete. There are no concrete categories, which absolutely suits the patriarchy beyond its wildest dreams, because it can never be called out on anything. It merely describes itself in a different way. So we're in this kind of moment where many professors, academics, researchers, whatever, are displaying their own credentials within that school of thought publicly, and they've got captive audiences with the people who depend on them for their grades and their careers, which is, you know, always an interesting one. It's always been a power imbalance in that sense, back to class, but now also in terms of reputation and people having witch hunts against them. So I don't want to ramble, but I think this young woman sounds like she knows what's what, and that she's been let down by academics who don't. Perhaps I should have said that was much quicker.
I would advise her to compile an informed argument, but next time it comes up, do some research on sexual objectification. Like I say, there are thousands, if not millions, of research done in every field you can think of. So if you find, a couple of hundred or 10 or 20 of those, and build your argument based on, as professors are supposed to teach you to do, on being informed. So I would play it that way, perhaps.
Yeah, evidence based. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
What do you think, Esther?
Well, I was going to say, I think that that there was recently the judicial review about very old convictions for soliciting, for example, and how they would no longer, for a group of women, Centre for Women's Justice brought it, and a group of women were challenging the fact these were on their records, and although they have been taken off their records for employment, the police and the Home Office considered that sort of information might be necessary if they were ever going to apply for positions of integrity or trust, like judges or police officers and things like that. And one of the issues that it wouldn't be possible, if that's the case, the reason for that would be that you would be liable to be blackmailed while you were in that position. And that would be no less the case if you were on any adult website or anything like that nowadays going forwards. And one thing which I think about adult websites, they eliminated part of the distinction between street and off-street prostitution, in that an adult website is the street, and you will be recognized, and that will never go away. And I'm quite sure that colleges that prided themselves on being able to get their alumni into the highest possible offices of state would not be in favor of people doing that, however they might couch it, because that would very definitely be the case. And I don't know if they would feel the same way about that level of about the objectification and stereotyping that goes into the sex trade, as they would if somebody were going into something which overtly stereotyped them on the basis of their ethnicity or something like that. One thing I think is quite interesting about othering is that it's connected with one of the commandments in the Torah: "Thou shalt not make unto thyself any graven image." It's a worship of images, and that sort of othering was recognized by United States civil rights leaders. And all the way that it's also filtered into, I mean, the really good research that came out from Fiona Vera Gray, Claire McGlynn, Ivan Qureshi, and Kate Butterby about sexual violence as a sexual script in mainstream online pornography. You're essentially promoting that kind of thing, which also filters into the way that people describe themselves like that on hookup sites, men do, and have a kind of sense of entitlement, and then an outrage when they find that the only people who respond to them want money for that kind of thing. But the kind of entitlement of heterosexual men, if that's something you should simply accept, it's kind of very disappointing, because to me it makes, it wouldn't make any difference whether if you're being objectified as a member of an ethnic community or a faith community, or as being objectified as a female. It is all equally reprehensible. But I don't think that they're addressing what the long-term consequences are for people getting involved in either of those. You're not going to end up being somebody who's like a big property developer. That will be the person that owns the magazines or owns the places you're working in.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's worth making clear for all our discussions, I'm sure everybody who's come along today has come in good faith, but just to make it clear that when we talk about, there's sometimes a kind of knee-jerk reaction, I think, to when somebody says not all men, as soon as you start talking about this topic or about men's violence, and there's that balance between, we know that inherently it is overwhelmingly heterosexual men who are sex buyers and who are consumers, and it's women and girls who are degraded and used, and that's not by any means to suggest that if a man is a victim, that's acceptable, that if a woman is a buyer, that's acceptable, that, you know, Michael touched on a little bit earlier, and so has Gemma so far as well, around the racist element of consuming pornography and accessing prostitution, and that applies to the white man is an easy example to hold up, but it does it's seen in every culture and every racial group, is that there's a particular subjugation of women and young people from outside their own racial or ethnic group as well. So I feel that's something I hope, I just want to make clear, and I hope everybody's okay with that. We do have, thank you all so much for replying to that young woman's question. We have had one that's come in live, where someone has asked this, particularly for Michael. I'm curious to know the background of the male speakers. So yourself, Michael, how do you think you've ended up with such a different opinion and approach to this subject than so many other men?
Gosh.
Not to put you on the spot.
Well, I've been really lucky to share the company and read the work of lots of women. I think really tough, forward-thinking, incisive, analytical women. Maybe one of them was me mum. I don't want to be too simplistic, but she was a good mum. She is a good mum. I haven't seen her for 8 months. I hope that changes soon. But yeah, maybe that it would be foolish of me to cut that out of because she brought me up on her own. It'd be foolish of me to cut that out of the equation. But it's hard to understand one's own development. But I would say, in very practical terms of accelerating things, starting to read stuff, even like by Andrea Dworkin and others, more names, whoever they may be, but actually taking the time and no longer thinking it was all a personal attack on me. I think that's really a problem with lots and lots of men and boys as well, that they think that the whole not all men palaver is a sign of immaturity and a sign of just not really listening. It's kind of like you're listening for offence, then you don't need to listen anymore. And whether, I don't know, bang my head or something, I think maybe I just stopped listening in that way. But I'm still full of it. I'm still 50. I'm 53 years old as a man in Britain, so I'm going to be well conditioned by that. There's no doubt. But I don't know is the answer. I'd have to be honest. I don't know, but I do wish that I'd had conversations when I was 13 or 14, 15, when I was just kind of fumbling my way through trying to work out what the hell was going on. That provided space. I mean, I went to school that was run by priests, so that was never going to happen. But there was no space, and I think that's really what we want to do. We want to make what wasn't there for us when we were younger, maybe. Maybe that's a common feeling. We want to sort of build the world we weren't part of. I don't know. That's not going to make much sense, but I know that by doing this and listening to people like you and Gemma and Esther and everybody, and Gail Dines, who I'm working on a project with for October, which is about porn versus sex education, which will be really good and big with speakers from 6 countries. But I know that just having a planning meeting with Gail, I'm thinking, shit, get your act together, mate. I've got to be up to the job to some extent. But that's not really probably helping you very much. But getting over, I think fundamentally getting over the feeling that you're being personally criticised when people are talking about structural historical conditions that do tend to give you advantage and unearned privilege and entitlement. And if it's that getting over that, which is what I want to do with boys, because then you can listen properly and understand the situation in which we find ourselves with different levels of power and opportunity and entitlement and safety and one thing and another. So yeah, I think maybe I was fortunate somehow. I think also I've had some mental health challenges of my own, and maybe they were including one particularly bad one some years ago. And I think possibly that was a moment when I kind of reconfigured some thoughts, and that coincided with meeting some really brilliant women who deliver the Freedom Programme, which some of you no doubt are familiar with. And it doesn't pull any punches, and it was at a time when I was ready for their no punches to be pulled, if that makes sense. And I took it for what it was, which is honest critique of the dysfunctional patriarchal culture. And I just try and keep going and keep listening.
That kind of, I feel, reflects on. That was really comprehensive, Michael. Thank you. And it did put you in the spot a little bit, so I appreciate that. But it sounds like, you know, following on from what both you and Gemma were saying earlier, is that there has to be, those dialogues have to exist, because this is a very real problem, and we hope that this webinar will be part of that. But making it clear to like boys and young men that we're not saying that they are specifically to blame for this, that this is a cultural issue, and it's understandably going to affect them and upset them, and they're going to be, unfortunately, inevitably, they're going to be exposed to it, and probably at a very young age and stage. And it's how we as adults take the responsibility to handle that, female and male adults take the responsibility to handle that, and be there for them to have those conversations, like the work that you're doing. So I hope that's a fair summation of what you came back with, Michael. For all three of you, you know, there's many questions both from today and from that we were already submitted that we could go to. I wonder, one we've kind of touched on, but I think a lot of people, based on the comments that we're seeing, would like us to go a bit more into detail around this. We have had a question on how can we encourage men to stop using pornography when it's already become so ingrained in our culture. We're talking about social change that might take years and even generations, and in the meantime pornography is so available, is taking over the internet. What can we do? What can individuals do? That would be really interesting to hear everyone's feedback on that.
I think the first thing to recognise about boys and pornography and gender stereotypes, all of it, is that the first acts of violence that a man will commit will be to himself, as in cutting off his emotional self. So we teach boys that emotions are female and therefore lesser than, so you've heard the term crying like a girl, instead of human, and therefore they don't develop emotional regulation skills, which is why when they're told no, they react violently. It's why they are more likely to be at risk of suicide, because they don't go to the doctor to ask for help because that's weak. And why they're more likely to die from cancer for the same reason. They don't go to the doctor because, you know, man up and all that stuff. And, you know, gender stereotypes, gender is a very damaging, limiting and harmful thing for our society, and the only person that benefits from gender is the person selling something in pink and blue, so they sell twice as much, and that's it, and no one else benefits from it. So why we see these gender stereotypes reinforced in pornography and things like that. So in pornography, we see the men dominant, in control, doing what they want, and the women being pretty and submissive and things. It reinforces almost, I don't know whether you call them man points, but, you know, like feeling more manly when they watch pornography. That is an issue as well. I think a good way to prevent addiction to pornography and exposure to it would be to talking to your children. And I know that a lot of parents don't like doing that, and I know that they feel like they want to keep their children innocent and that they shouldn't be having those conversations, but the reality of the situation isn't that you are keeping them innocent, you are keeping them vulnerable, and that's not the same thing. The reality is that 1 in 3 schoolgirls of school age experience unwanted sexual touching. The reality is that pornography exposure is 11 years old, and that our society, our media, our TV, our movies, our games, our music industry, our fashion industry, the diet industry, everything is saturated by influence of pornography. And it's also a fact that, you know, when it comes to child sexual abuse, they're often committed by family members or family friends. So if you talk to your child about pornography, about what's acceptable behaviour and what isn't, what consideration is, what respect is, what consent is, and that can be in any sort of relationship. If you talk to your child about those boundaries and about the uncomfortable sex conversation, then they know that if something does happen, they can come to you and talk to you about it. And that stops the perpetrator from having that tool of making them keep it a secret because you know you're not supposed to talk about these things. So it's really important that you just talk to your child about relationships, talk to your child about pornography, talk to them about so I spoke to my son about pornography. He has a mental disability, and I spoke to him and I said about consent and pornography and how people sometimes say, well, women choose to be in pornography. I said, would you eat a spider? And he said, no. I said, well, what if mummy was really ill and she would die without this medicine, but if you ate this spider, someone would give you money for that medicine to save mum? Would that mean you wanted to eat the spider? And he said, no, I wouldn't want to eat the spider, but I'd do it because I'd want to save you. So you can really make things age appropriate and talk to them about their other friends' phones and things. So talk to your children is what I'd advise.
Yeah.
But a mum, a woman, a mother in the comments talked about having 2 young teenage boys, and that she speaks with them often about those damaging gender stereotypes and about objectification, and she's worried that her voice alone isn't enough. And it's I think it's maybe giving that message to her that it is good to have other adults and other resources, but your example and your voice, your knowledge is really key as well.
I'd tell her to get books for her boys by Jackson Katz. I tell her to look at Michael's website as well for resources to use for teenage boys. Mm-hmm. There are people like Terry Crews in America. There's the guy that was on Peep Show, whose name I can never remember, but he talks about gender stereotypes as well. So there are male figures out there, because we know from research that boys are more likely to listen to men because, there are boys that they can relate to, and that's like with any group, and that's fine. So I would suggest maybe linking them to stuff like that as well.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
I think that's very true also, and I think sometimes it's also I think a lot of people, especially if they're younger, but also it's not exclusively if they're younger, men may not realize when they see something on porn that it's a bit like the difference between stage fighting and a brawl in the street, in that a lot of it is the force is used because it's more visual, because of its visual impact. It would be sort of, the people making it would regard it as boring to watch if it didn't have that, and also as a result, people I think they're quite well aware that people may end up being aroused by that type of thing. But if you did that kind of thing in real life, serious injuries would result. I mean, spitting on someone is an assault, for example, in England and Wales. They'd have to prove that there was no consent on your part. It's an assault. And there are a lot of it, because it happened, because some of the injuries that can be done by some of the things that you see on porn, if you saw them on someone's face, you'd know it was actual bodily harm or grievous bodily harm, but you don't see it. And for obvious reasons, when they're talking about these things in reports in the press or in court reports, they don't go into too much detail about them, but very serious injuries are caused a lot of the time in the fantasy that you see. And but I actually think because of the all the people speaking up after the death of Sarah Everard, I actually had several teenage boys in my kind of wider social network. Really, they all randomly came to speak about things where they had sort of become aware that people in their circle and also in their school, which is why I was very concerned. I was very concerned about the NEU votes about exclusions, not because because it seemed to me that there are definitely issues around exclusions, but that it was from what these young teenage boys had said to me, that there were people who they knew in their schools who had done things, and also outside, and but it was the courage of the teenage girls to speak up in their groups on things like Snapchat about what had happened to them, that it was very inspiring to me, the reaction that had on some of on these young boys. And when I said to them, what do you think would have caused somebody to have done this more than once over a number of times before they had even got into year 12? And their immediate response, both of these people independently, was online porn. So they're actually aware themselves. And to me, that you can step back and see what that has resulted in. I was really pleased that sort of you would have an awareness of that. So I don't think Michael is alone, and I don't think that I think there are young boys, teenagers and things who are very well aware of these types of things. The other thing is the idea that people women who are in porn or in prostitution are there went into it because they have high libidos. This is an absolute fantasy that's projected on all sorts of people. I had an interesting kind of a way of comparing that with something else. I went to a grime gig, and there was somebody standing very close who was playing a villain in a very popular series, and was completely mobbed by people saying, "Oh, please, can you speak in the voice that you speak when you're being the villain?" And he got very anxious in the end and moved away. And I was then the people who I was with mentioned that he had said that his playing this villain on has resulted in that he's anxious about going out of his house. People shout in the street, come past in the cars, shout out at him because they can't differentiate the actor from what that person is like in real life. And that really happens a lot if you're involved in the sex trade, about what people think you are like afterwards. I think all of those are important. And I think that there was also a sort of projection from porn and prostitution about a sort of like a bucket list of activities, that it's like going through different grades until you get this A star in something or other, rather than it having anything to do with anything else. And some of it has a lot of mystification associated with it through porn and prostitution. So it's somewhere on a spectrum between a kind of religious ritual and a IKEA self-assembly manual, trying to go through one of those, and completely out of the context in which you would be if it were in real life.
Do you mean with that, Esther, is that, as I've understood it, and please let me know yourself, and probably Michael can speak to that as well if I've misunderstood, is it that idea of like the pet rodent at the food bar, where like it's a constant kind of need for gratification and taking it up, ratcheting it up to the next level, like you're not satisfied by this anymore, so it's taking it up to the next level. Is that what?
Well, it's partly that, but it's also this idea that you're not an experienced person unless you have done XYZ activity. Right. And that, I think, is in it, that completely removes the act from anything to do with the person you're with, or what they might like, or any kind of mutual thing between you. It's like, I've got to do this, and then I can talk to my friends, male friends probably, that I have done this. Whereas, and that kind of thing, I find, I think that can put a lot of pressure on people, and
boys and girls, I imagine. Yeah.
And the other thing which I was aware of from some of the things that I was speaking to about with young men, my sort of social network, was that some of the consent education, with the best possible motives, has actually made some of the young men better at, they know these protocols to go through in order to make it look as if somebody had consented, for example. And fortunately, in a couple of cases that they mentioned, there'd been other witnesses there, but it's a bit like when there was sort of group therapy for sex offenders in prisons, which it didn't work, and the kind of Home Office covered up the fact that
it gave them that language, didn't it?
Yes,
to be able to,
that had very clearly happened. It staggered me that somebody had who some sort of young people who were that young had already picked up that. For you some of the time with that type of education, you have to look at how it might be interpreted counterintuitively as well. not everybody would be reading that from the same, coming from the same place. And so it's a bit like, and the entitlement issue is perhaps something that, rather than the sort of bits and pieces about how to get around, but if somebody will look at someone saying this is how someone shows consent, and then they will just say, well, have I got this person to do this? And then they will go and do precisely what they like, and so it's more trying not to put it in that framework necessarily, although consent is obviously the very important thing. I mean, the Judicial College guidance that the judges give to juries has got lots of things in it about sort of fear and that submission is not consent and stuff like that. But I think some of the people might have picked up things from the consent, what they've read about sort of consent that has actually helped them be better at getting around it.
And while that's absolutely linked, Esther, is a really good point. I know we could all be here for hours talking about every possible arm of all of this, and it would be amazing to have all three of you for like a 24-hour spiel if we could. I'm wondering if Michael and or Gemma can speak to some of the things you had touched on previously, which was that idea of that kind of constant, that one-upmanship, that peer pressure that you kind of touched on before. And also that idea of making sure that when what organisations like Men at Work do is when we do have these education programmes that they are implemented successfully and don't cause an outcome that we don't want. Would both of you be able to feedback on that as your experience?
I'll let Michael go. Go ahead, Michael.
Well, there's two things. One is about being aware that the work you do can be weaponized. Is that kind of picking up on the point Esther was making? I think, isn't it? If you blunder in with something that hasn't been thought through, then it could be, knowing. It's like, I suppose, like going to prison. Sometimes people pick up all kinds of skills that they didn't have before from others, whatever the crime field may be. That is true, but hopefully, I mean, which is why I put the dialogues out for free and say, just read them, have a go, tell us what you think. They're not the 10 commandments, they're 10 conversations that if people say, you know what, I've got some misgivings about that, then brilliant. I will rewrite and other people can do their thing. But it's basically trying to get to the root of what words mean and why we are developing in the way we develop. And I think critical self-reflection is not something that's easily weaponized, I don't think. And having to face difficult truths about oneself is something that I think feeds into humility a little bit, and a bit of kind of stepping back and being less sure of oneself, and I think that's not a bad thing. So I take the point, and certainly there are those sex offender kind of group work things I think have finished. If not, then they all should do, because there were no evidence whatsoever of them being effective. On the contrary, as Esther alluded to, but also to pick up on the idea of the bucket list that Esther was saying. Basically, it's like, what are the Pornhub categories? How many can I do, and how many have I done? That is a thing with some people, with some young men. It's certainly, clearly, can't make a blanket statement, but it's a thing, and that is an outcome of this kind of dehumanizing categorization of product differentiation. I think Gemma said, use that term. I think about the subject and the objects and the product differentiation. The categories. I was once really disturbed. I was talking to a group of year 9 lads, so that in England, so they are year 9, 13. I think it is, isn't it? Yeah, 13-ish, maybe 13, 14 cusp. And they were just reeled off 20 or 30 categories, sleeping, drunk, whatever what all the categories. And I was saying, what, you've seen these things? And when they go, and then they kind of stop and say, well, no, but I've seen the categories, I've seen the menus. Now, the truth of whether they had or not, I don't know. That's it's a difficult thing to establish. But the fact that they're aware of and carrying around this kind of mental menu of how to look at women and young girls as a kind of list of activities or character types, or ethnic types, or whatever it is, fat, thin, any way of breaking people down into categories is there. And boys who are 13, 14, they're familiar with that language. I think Gail Downs talks a lot about the visual language, visual grammar of pornography, and they're aware of that. And so the question is, the challenge is for me in work anyway, is to acknowledge that they are aware of things and then say, where do we go from here? Because we can't press a button and they don't know it anymore. It's about how do we contextualize that understanding of the world that you've been presented with. They didn't write it. They're not funding, they didn't set porno. The 13-year-olds, they didn't do it. But the challenge is, how do we detach ourselves from that and become opponents of it and critics of it, and have healthy, happy lives with whoever we end up with, girlfriends or boyfriends or whoever it may be. And that's the challenge, is not to be naive. I think people who say we shouldn't talk about porn or prostitution, I think it's really coming from a very place of naivety, and it's really risky, and I would never ever endorse that. I think you've got to think, here we are, we're in this place, there's a lot messed up, let's address that and move forward and see how we can change the world.
And it's understanding that young boys and girls have that, they're at that age and they have that, they are burgeoning at an age in an age-appropriate way. Sexuality and curiosity isn't the problem.
No, of course not.
And isn't their fault. It's what they're exposed to at that time.
Yeah.
Seems to be making the difference. So Gemma, what would you
I might come across as the stereotypical mean feminist here, so pre-warning. But essentially what we have here is it's accountability. We need to teach boys accountability and responsibility. So the Yes Matters programme I do is based on National Occupational Standards of Youth Work, and that teaches them critical analysis. It teaches them, okay, I'm being told that this is the way to be. Why am I being told that? Does that benefit me? Is that healthy for me? Does it benefit the person telling me to be like that, and how? So developing critical analysis skills are really important, but I also think that a lot of it is with this condoning and enabling of the boys will be boys culture. And we need to recognise the other side of the boys will be boys coin is sexual abuse is part of growing up for girls and women. And we need to take responsibility for that. And some people, claim, that boys and men, they do it out of naivety. But frankly, boys and men know why they don't want to end up in a prison shower. They know why that is. When they have a teenage daughter, men stop saying not all men, and they suddenly start admitting, yes, all men, so you can't go there, you can't wear that, you can't do this. This isn't out of naivety. If it has to be either men and boys have self-control, in which case they have to take responsibility for their actions, and we need to stop condoning and enabling bad behaviour because boys will be boys, or they don't have self-control, so they shouldn't be running our justice system, our governments, our religions and our corporations. You can't have it both ways. It sort of has to be one or the other. Now, I believe that boys do have self-control and men do have self-control, and I believe that, instead, whenever someone says, oh, boys will be boys, I say, no, you need to challenge that behaviour just like you would with a girl, and that they need to accept responsibility for their actions, and they have to regulate their emotions and behaviour ready for the adult world, because that's not acceptable. Boys respond well to that. And it is important when you're talking to boys about sexism and violence against women to talk about the male gender stereotypes, to talk about how that's bad for them, because then they can then relate that when you come to talking about women and girls, they then understand having looked at how it's not okay to be in this man box, that it is good to be able to not put women in women boxes as well. But yeah, I think accountability has to be a big thing. We need to stop condoning and enabling this behaviour. And I guess to all the men that have been shouting "not all men" in the wake of the Sarah Everard things, the first thing is that men's feelings don't matter more than women's lives. And the second thing is, if not all men, prove it with your actions. All these so-called good guys, you need to be proving not all men. Child pornography numbers shouldn't be higher than child maintenance payments. If you're such good guys, get out there and prove it and do something about it.
Well, that's quite a statistic there. That's, I absolutely believe you, but it's quite, when you actually hear it as starkly as that,
I'm always full of cheery information.
You do. You've always got the shocker at the end. I love it. I guess for all of you, this is actually very selfishly because I've got you here and I'm chairing the discussion. This is one I think kind of springs off from everything we've covered so far, but I'm wondering where, for parents and carers and older siblings and teachers and anybody who's concerned, and also just people like myself out of curiosity, where is it on the internet? We talk about like boys and young men sort of stumbling on this information even when they're not looking for it. Where, from the three of your own experiences, where would that be? I guess the obvious ones for me are YouTube, possibly. And one I can think of is fan fiction, which I know it may not be your thing, and that's fine, but I know that young people who do read and make fan fiction, you do notice over the years it has got increasingly dark and increasingly sexualized. It's something that feedback I've heard, so I wonder if any of you have any kind of feedback on that and anything else where you think that might be coming up.
All media does that. All media has become more violent and sexualized as time has come on, to be more popular, more talked about, more viewed, more shocked. And pornography is no different, especially since it's become more free, and essentially with camera phones, everyone could be a potential pornographer. I think the reality is that the government does need to act on regulation around pornography and access to children. Because if an individual man showed a child 2 images of pornography, they could be done for child grooming, and yet a corporation doesn't seem to have any accountability, and I think that's important. Well, we do have regulation. You're not allowed to show female ejaculation in pornography. Take from that what you will. I think the other thing to recognise is, again, it's the talking to your child, because you can talk to your child about it, but that doesn't mean that their mates won't show them something on their phones on the bus or, things like that. So the reality is, again, you're not keeping them innocent, you're keeping them unprepared, you're not giving them the tools to deal with this stuff. So talk to them.
Somebody's put in the comments about somebody's put a suggestion, they've kind of framed it as a question, but I wonder if it links in with this, about the portrayal of lovable men, quote unquote, who objectify women, and their example is Barney in How I Met Your Mother. Which is a good example of that. So
yeah, and James Bond and the persistent romantic, and well, we shame women more for having consensual sex, and we shame men for raping, don't we, essentially? So that's a problem.
Yeah.
Sorry, Michael, I'll let you go.
No, everything you said is absolutely true, isn't it? It's like in the mainstream, are just slightly more subtle versions of what happens on the periphery. As it's a James Bond, for example. But and many others. I just think a lot of kids, boys and girls, are because porn is finding them rather than they're looking for it in some cases. Because porn just wants to explode everywhere and be picked up by everybody and interacted with and repeated, and because of with the internet even more so, like hugely, like the algorithms, it just finds young people, whether you could be looking for something totally innocent on YouTube, and because of keywords, because of previous searches of other people who've looked for that, anything will come up in the sidebars. So the best filter, I think, for children is a good ongoing conversation, as Gemma said. It's like that dialogue with those, you know, adults who've got responsibility for them, to have really ongoing kind of open door conversations about things that they will find troubling, that are out there. It's really almost impossible to imagine that you could get to 14, 15, 16 now without having encountered porn. And the prostitution with which it is, of course, symbiotic. Somehow or other, you will come across it. There is no doubt about it. So we just need to accept that as a fact, and get the tools and the skills widely shared by adults who've got to take the lead. As you know, it's just normal parenting, isn't it? A collective, communal parenting as well as a society. Is build the skills, build the resilience, build the understanding of why. It's like Gemma was saying, talking about those occupational skills. Why are those? What do they get from you further in their business plan? Which it comes down to: is it money? Is it cultural power? Is it that their values are being cemented? They're getting something, and be aware of the agendas of others, and how that's not going to be in your best interest long term.
And well, I'm getting a notification that we are over time slightly, just because this has been so interesting. I think people are getting a lot out of it, but I'm aware of the day passing. So thank you, Michael and Gemma, for your contributions on that so far. Esther, is there anything that's not already been said that you would sort of say to that same topic, and just sort of a brief summation, and then we can go into wrapping up for everyone, if that's okay?
No, I agree with that entirely. And I also think there's a big crossover between actual real acts of real violence outside sex, which are online, like the kind of you know, sort of people being decapitated and things like that, and a lot of stuff around Abu Ghraib and things like that, which sort of Guantanamo, which has also filtered over because they kind of in the online world, they're competing for clicks, and so the general violence that you might be exposed to, including sexual violence, is quite serious, and definitely being able to have a conversation is really important. I get the impression that where the cases that I know of where that hadn't happened, that the young men who had developed these things solely from porn were the people who knew how to get around the consent issues, and they didn't have anybody at home who would talk to them without them being kind of told off about it.
Yeah, good points.
Good points, absolutely. And again, we could be here all day, but I appreciate the time that you've already taken, and the time that also everybody who's attended has taken, and all the questions that have come in. So thank you so much, everybody. And with that, especially, I hope where you are, it's a nice day. It's a nice day here. So to have taken the time to sit in on a nice afternoon and listen to this discussion today, and to partake in this discussion today, we really appreciate that. So I'll move into wrapping up. Hopefully, what I'll cover just now, a few people have asked in the comments that they missed some reading resources, or they missed how to find you all online, or how to find Nordic Model Now online. So I'll go over that just now. We do plan to release a recording of this webinar on our YouTube channel, as we've done with our previous webinars. There may be a delay of a week or two. We are all volunteers while we process it. If you subscribe to our YouTube channel, you should get a notification of when it's up, and transcript should be available in due course on our website as well. And we'll repeat that information in the Q&A and in the chat for you as well. Bryn Freyr Smith, who was the recorded speaker we heard from, is on Twitter at Blue Bear Coffee 1, number 1, and he's the host of the Justice and Coffee podcast. Gemma can be found at Gemma_Brett, BRETT, and at matters_yes. Michael can be found through his organisation Men at Work, which is on Twitter at Men at men@work_MC. You can tell I've chatted too much already today. Esther, who contributed today, is not on Twitter. So what can people do is a consistent question that we've been getting throughout this webinar, and that we get generally. you'll have that information on the slide, but also to help you out, if you live in the UK, please write to your MP and ask them to support the Nordic model. To help you do that, we've got a 2-minute tool that sends a template letter, and also tips for writing your own message if you do want to be more comprehensive. When I know everywhere says, oh, it'll just take you 2 minutes. I did this when it first came up. It literally does take you 2 minutes, and you can find links to both of these on our website. So the link to the 2-minute tool and the link to developing your own message. If you feel that you need help talking to kids or with kids about this topic, make friends with Culture Reframed. They've developed expert help for parents, including scripted conversations for you to have with your kids as a guide, and also have a look at Gemma's and Michael's work and Twitter, of course, as well. Michael also sent us all, which is very important, the Childline has sponsored a video that promotes pornography to children, which completely contradicts everything we've chatted about today. So to ask them to stop pushing pornography, again, we will share the link, but there is a petition through ipetitions.com to stop Childline normalising the use of pornography. And finally, for Nordic Model Now ourselves, follow us and share our stuff. We've got tons of information and survivor testimony on our website. Any of the questions that you submitted that we didn't get round to today, or maybe didn't answer as fully as you would have liked or had follow up with, you should hopefully find examples and articles on our website that can help you with that. And obviously, please get in touch with us through the means I'm about to share with you if there is anything else. We're at nordicmodelnow.org. We're on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram, all as @Nordic Model Now. And we're also on YouTube as well. So you should see that information on the slides and in the chat as well. And I know it has been posted there previously. And as I say, with this webinar, for watching again or for sharing it with anyone else, we will have that up as soon as possible. And just finally, I would just like to thank once again Gemma, Michael and Esther for being with us today, and Bryn for taking the time to submit the video recording to us as well. So thank you so much, everyone, for taking the time out your afternoon.
Could I also add, if any young people who have suffered child sexual abuse who need help, rehabilitation and support, they can access it for free via Yes Matters, and it's not time constricted and there's no money involved.
Okay, that's really great. Thank you for that. Okay, well, all the best to all of you, and to everyone who attended today. Thank you again for doing that, and all the best for the rest of your Sunday.
Thank you.
Take care.